Absolutely. Thank you, Jim. Appreciate it. And thank you to Central Region SSD and Jim and the others leading this effort to have these presentations. Really appreciate the time here. And we're going to talk about driving the radar today. So this is an interesting, this became an interesting study when it comes to, trying to figure out some approaches to scanning strategies. And my portion of this presentation is just going to be a brief radar refresher of a couple of key concepts that are players within scanning strategies. I want to remind folks that WDTD has a wealth of training information, especially when it gets to the radar applications course, on a lot of the fundamental components that drive our radar. And it's always a good idea to go back and make sure that you refresh yourself on those every once in a while. It's very well done, and I've referenced them quite a bit when coming up with this presentation and some of these slides. So remember that resource is there, and if you're not remembering things well, again, I'm getting older myself, getting advanced in age. I forget things, as Jim and I were just talking about. I've had bifocals, so I'm getting old. These are things that you can do to make sure you have the latest and greatest information on the components within the radar that we tend to take for granted. So one of the first things I want to talk about is AVSET. So this is one of those things that's a setting on our radar that is probably almost always on, and that's a good thing. Rarely is AVSET ever needed to really be to be turned off. So AVSET basically allows the radar to enact faster full volume scans. So if there are no coverage of echoes aloft, it's the following three conditions that are on the page here. You can read through those, and those are the conditions that need to be met. If those are met on any of the 5.1 tilts or above, then the next tilt will be the last elevation sampled. So this enables to, when there's not any growth aloft, to end the scan and go back down to 0.5, begin again, and that enables a faster volume scan. I've talked to a lot of different people about, when would you ever want AVSET off? And really the only situation that I've seen or heard about is it's really not ideal with elevated convection that develops near the radar. This becomes obviously probably a little bit of a bigger problem out west, where radar coverage can be a little more sparse, and you have different elevations of radars. So not necessarily a bigger problem in the flatlands, but nevertheless, that's probably the one time you would consider, hey, I want to make sure I be able to get these cuts of developing convection aloft very close to the RDA. So by and large, AVSET, very positive thing, and something that definitely enables faster scans. And rarely are you going to have to consider this, but nevertheless, it's a big player in how fast our scans are. Next up is PRF, and this is one of the variables from our radar, one of the settings in our radar that's really undergone a lot of improvements from an engineering perspective. So in recent years, we've had the switch to auto PRF, and there's two different types. There's auto PRF Storm, which is by default, which takes your three strongest cells as identified in SCIT, and the strength of a cell, the basic definition is you got to have a VIL greater than 20. So it's going to take a look at the storms with the highest VIL values, and then hone in on those, and then create a 20 nautical mile range ring around those, and then come up with what is the best PRF for those three particular cells. So this obviously is something that performs pretty well with isolated convection, and it's a process that occurs on every single volume scan. So this is something that is constantly monitored and can change from scan to scan. So if you do have situations with a more widespread convective coverage, it is possible that those strongest cells change both in position and location based on whatever the highest VIL values are. So that's perhaps some of the cons that come with the auto PRF storm, is that it can jump around with a higher coverage of convection. There is another auto PRF storm for a single storm, and that option allows you, the forecaster, to intervene and select a particular cell of interest. So perhaps you have a storm of the day or something that's really strengthening or strong, and it's the best cell or best feature that's out there, and you really want to make sure you get the best look at it. You actually have the option to go in and hone in on that particular cell by going into the GUI and selecting it. The next up is auto PRF elevation, and this is something that does not focus on individual storms or intensity, and it uses the entire half-degree scan to determine which PRF produces the lowest range folding aerial coverage. When auto PRF is also used when there aren't quote-unquote storms around, so there's nothing with VIL over 20, then auto PRF elevation is what is enacted. And then the ultimate in control, if you will, is the manual PRF option. And that's where the radar operator or whomever they ask selects the PRF desired. If you're in VCP, a non-200 VCP, you can do this up into 3 sectors. If you are in a 200 VCP, you do have the option to do a manual PRF, but you have to pick one that is then applied over the entire scan. There is no sectorization. So on the bottom right or the bottom parts of these slides, you're going to see some references that are there for those who would like to look deeper into this. And for this one, we have a ROC reference. And just some other PRF reminders. So, there's everybody remembers the Doppler dilemma. So the higher the PRF, the higher the Vmax, but it comes at the expense of your range, your maximum range, and then vice versa. The lower your PRF, you have a better range maxima, but it comes at the expense of velocity quality, and that's the Doppler dilemma. There are PRF options 2 to 8 available in manual PRF, but you're going to want to avoid options 2 and 3. They're really not recommended for severe situations. You do start to see velocity issues, data quality go down as you get to PRF 4 and certainly below that. And then for auto PRF, the options 4 to 8 are what are available. And as I mentioned before, in the 200 VCPs, you're now able to manually select a PRF, but it's applied over the entire scan. So again, the Central Region TWIP put out a great PRF recommendation document. That's something that I've referenced here. Also got WDTD reference material here that goes into a lot of things PRF, far more than what I've been able to get into. But again, I want to remind you of some key players that really affect scanning strategies, and AVSET and PRF are included. So, Jim, we're going to go ahead and start with our first poll question. And what I want to do is just kind of get an idea of how often do you alter PRF during severe weather events? Is this something that you do frequently, or is this something that, man, rarely do I ever do this, or is it something in between? So just roughly speaking, how often do you alter PRF during severe weather events?
John, can you see the responses as they're coming in?
This is new for me, so I don't know.
Okay, I can see them.
Good.
I don't know.
Can you report back on some? Do you have any results?
Yes. So we got about a little over 50% of the attendees, which we're up to almost 70 people, have responded.
Cool.
And between A, B, and C, it's about a third, and then
okay.
D it's oscillating between 2 and 5%. So A, B, and C is about 33%. C is about 30%, and then D is 3%.
Okay, so basically, it's not something that's done frequently.
Not frequently. The most,
Okay.
yeah, the most right now, again, it keeps changing because people are voting, but B is the most at 37% now.
Okay, B is. Okay, good.
Yep.
So
Yep.
it's something that people are at least familiar with. They've got their mind's eye on. It's not something that they necessarily forget about. It's something that's in, and that's kind of the point. The point of this presentation is to kind of provide kind of a mental jolt, some reminders, just some considerations, some things to think about. And the good news is that we're not heavy on the rarely if ever responses. So that's good. That makes me feel better, and that's going to help as we go down the road here, because as the slides go on, things get more interesting. Jim, I think we're ready to go on. Are you okay with that?
Yeah. Can you see the results now on the screen there?
No, I don't, unfortunately.
Okay. I'm sharing the results with everybody there just so they can see the results. But
okay, cool.
All right. So now I'm going to hide
good.
it. Okay.
All right, good. So we'll go ahead and move on. We'll have another poll question here very shortly. It's going to be a little bit easier. So let's talk about some VCPs. And I was obviously coordinating with the Radar Operations Center, the other ROC, when it came to this presentation, and they were nice enough to go ahead and give us a quick look at the new quick reference chart for VCPs for the upcoming Build 19 that's coming later this year, which includes a change to including VCP 112. Not really the focus of this particular presentation. We're going to focus on 12 and 212. We're not going to talk about the general surveillance or the 30 VCPs. But I want to give people an idea that this reference is going to be coming out again. It's going to be updated. And we're going to focus on VCPs 12 and 212, as they are obviously the VCPs of choice when it comes to severe convection situations. So Jim, let's go ahead to that next poll question. Going to keep you busy here. And this one's easy. What is your preferred VCP for severe weather? This will be interesting.
Yeah,
go ahead.
I think this is going to be pretty interesting results here, John. We got about 50% have voted so far.
Cool.
Like I said, I think I figured out now I can close it and then show the results on the screen. I don't know if you can see it, but Mike Fowle texted me here, and he said that he could see them. So.
Oh, good. Yeah, I'm flying blind, so you're going to need to be my eyes on that one.
Yeah, right on, right on.
Remember, I got bifocals.
Yeah. All right, so we got about 60% voted, so I'm going to close it. I'm going to share it with the attendees. And so 92% said 212 and 8% said 12.
Okay, and that is very much what I expected, because over the past week, I've been looking at, the ROC actually has a link to active VCPs. And every late afternoon before shutting it down for the day, I went and looked and see how many people were in 212 and how many offices were in 12. Now, it's not independent. This could have been multiple offices days in a row or whatnot. But I saw 187 times where VCP 212 was used, and 25 times where VCP 12 was used. So this makes sense. This makes sense. I think everybody prefers VCP 212, and it's completely understandable. There's a tremendous amount of fabulous engineering that's gone into VCP 212. It comes in, each scan, it has its own PRF selection. The range folding for that first trip is well controlled. It really does keep range folding at bay, little bit of data quality, things like that. So it's understandable why people would want to gravitate towards VCP 212. So thank you, Jim. We will have some more poll questions a little bit later in this presentation with Brian's part of the talk. So we'll go ahead and move on. And VCP 12 versus 212, both ideal for severe weather, both have the same elevation cuts and coverage. There are some pros and cons, and that's what I want to kind of get into a little bit here, where VCP 212, by far the fastest VCP in our arsenal, which is great. there is the potential for range folding that can be an issue, and that can crop up. It can be fine for a good period of time, but as storms get closer to or farther away from the radar, range folding can become an issue, and perhaps at some not so ideal times. So you kind of have to be on your toes with using VCP-12 in that regard. There is some indications from the engineers that there's perhaps a little bit of a sacrifice in data quality, but it's not substantial. I don't really have anything to really sink my teeth in to say that the data quality is that bad. However, when you go to VCP-212, and pardon my inability to say the following two names there, but we're just going to call it the ZC2 technique, that does lend to better data quality. Especially on those Doppler cuts where they reduce range folding, and it's a better base data estimate. Again, don't have anything really hard and fast to sink my teeth into, but it's a slower scan, and thereby has, because of that, a little better base data estimates. But I don't want to go into this and tell people that VCP-212 data quality is bad. That's not true. It's just that 212 is a little bit better because the scan can be slower. Now, VCP-212 is, in the documentation, quoted as having improved severe weather surveillance at greater distances from the radar. So that is one of the advantages of 212 over 12. And remember, your options to go into manual PRF. You have a lot more freedom in the manual PRF situation with VCP-12 to address rain folding, as you can sectorize it. Very rarely do we have situations where, perhaps a one size fits all, and we want to be able to have different PRFs for different portions of our area, especially on an active weather day. So the bottom line here is that both are great VCPs, but they have advantages and disadvantages to keep in mind when it comes to your scanning strategies. And I think me going through this investigation and sharing this with folks on the TWIP and WDTD and the Radar Operations Center and of course Brian, as we were doing this presentation, is okay. So we know VCP-212 is a little bit slower, but how slow is slow? And as always, the answer is it depends. So the ZC2 requires 64 pulses per radial, regardless of PRF. So if you remember with the VCP-12, and we talked about PRF earlier, your PRF changes based on what number of PRF you're on. So if you're on PRF 8, you have a lot of pulses going out of the radar. If you're closer to PRF 4 or lower, you have a lower number of pulses going out. Well, it's not variable in VCP-212. It requires 64 pulses per radial, regardless of PRF. So as a result, engineering-wise, the scan rate is forced to vary. So it's a slower rate in the lower PRFs and a faster rate for your higher PRFs. So as a result, in VCP-212, your scan times can vary on your Doppler cuts. So for the vast majority of radars, that's the lowest 3 cuts, the 0.5, the 0.9, and the 1.3. There are some radars, I should say a few radars now that do that on a 4th one, where they have a 4th Doppler cut on there, usually out west where we have some elevations that go negative to shoot downward. So the key that I want you to understand here is that in VCP-212, your scan time can vary. So assuming a full scan up to the 19.4 degree scan and not accounting for sales or Merl, you can have a variance of 4 minutes and 15 seconds to 4 minutes and 51 seconds to complete a full volume scan. Okay. Also, another thing to remember when you come to these times that are quoted, you also have to give some slosh for radar retrace, which the engineering quotes is about 10 seconds. So you have to add 10 seconds to this when you consider the radar kind of going up and down and then resetting, coming from 19.4 back down to 0.5. All right. So now let's get into mesosales and Merl. And this complicates things, especially when it comes to scan times, and we'll get to that in just a second. So the following 2 slides, you're going to see everything that's quoted time-wise based on VCP-12. Now, sales and mesosales have been around for many years, and by far, much like VCP-212 versus VCP-12, Sales is by far enacted far more times than Merl. And hopefully this is a presentation that'll help maybe pull back a little bit more on the applicability of Merl. But nevertheless, just as a reminder, you have options for 1 to 3 supplemental 0.5 scans within a full volume scan. And as evenly as possible, depending upon which sales you pick, 1, 2, or 3, the 0.5 cuts are spaced as evenly as possible. So the engineering behind it is you start out with your Doppler cuts. If you're in sales 1 or 2, you go up anywhere between 4 to 6 volume scans, and then you come back down and do another cut. And then you do a couple more scans, and then you come back down and do the 0.5 cut again. And for sales 3, that is obviously a higher frequency. So you're up, down, up, down, up, down, up. So you can imagine radar's working hard. You're working that radar hard, but it's at great advantage because you're going to be able to get half-degree update elevation times on a faster cadence, and in many cases as fast as say a minute 15 seconds to a minute and a half on average, especially for sales 3. So that's a great thing. That's a high advantage for 0.5 cuts. Now what about Merl? Okay, let's take a look at Merl. So Merl scanning, what's happening here is you are going to have the first, say 7 or 8 cuts done. You get up to the 5.1 cut, and then you're going to come back down. And depending upon your Merl option, you basically there's really 3 Merl options: the 0.9, the 1.3, and the 1.8. So you have the option to do, an extra 0.5, an extra 0.5, and an extra 0.9. An extra 0.5, 0.9, and 1.3, or an extra 0.5, 0.9, 1.3, and 1.8 scans. So that's how it goes. Merl 1 is 0.5, Merl 2 is 0.5 and 0.9, Merl 3, add the 1.3, Merl 4, all 4 of them up to 1.8. And that is all done in one chunk. So the radar, unlike in sales, is not going up, down, up, down, up, down. It goes to the 5.1, comes back down and either does 1, 2, 3, or 4 of the cuts, then goes back and resumes and then finishes the scan and comes back to the 0.5 and rinse and repeat. So the Merl is really nice when you're starting to consider vertical continuity. So this is where you get into the situations where you really want to pay attention to structure that's not necessarily just myopically focused at the 0.5 level. And again, depending upon where you're at from the distance from the radar, and then what type of hazard or what type of mode you're in severe weather-wise, be it linear or cellular or supercellular, you need to understand that sometimes the 0.5 may cut under the cloud base. So there are times where getting that 0.9 and 1.3 and perhaps even 1.8 are going to be very much to your advantage. And Brian's going to go deeper into this with the second half of the presentation. So on the right side there's just some quotes in the Times for VCP 12. You can see a standard VCP finishes in about 243 seconds. Got to give that extra 10 seconds for a reset in the standard VCP 212, and you get the 4 minutes and 10-ish seconds that it usually does. Merl 2, 3, and 4, you can see how much time that tends to add. Again, the Doppler cuts all take about 31 seconds in VCP 212. So if you're enacting Merl 4 with VCP 212 and you have an entirely full scan at 19.5, you're just shy of 6 minutes for using Merl. So now here's putting it all together, kind of looking at VCP 12 again, looking at the standard elevation on the first column, and then sales 1, 2, and 3, and then Merl 2, 3, and 4, kind of give you an idea of how long in VCP 212, again, that's the caveat, VCP 212 and a full scan through 19.5, those are the times that you would expect to see a full scan completed. Now, again, go back to AVSET, anything from the 6.4 on up, if you don't have any echoes that meet those qualifications, those 3 qualifications from our first slide, that will take time off, right? So AVSET is very much a potential time saver. So again, when it comes to the it depends part of how long does a scan take, it really does depend. There's a lot of moving parts here. And these are things that you want to keep in mind. So now what about VCP 212. Now, remember from our previous slides, it's very much PRF dependent. So it depends on what PRF that is being selected for that particular cut. And again, it can vary from cut to cut based on the settings that you have for your PRF, whether you're an auto PRF storm, where it picks the 3 strongest storms, auto PRF single storm, where you pick the strongest storm, or elevation, auto PRF elevation, or manual. So it really depends on what your PRF is. So when it comes down to it, and again, I've checked with the rock engineers on this, and this is the kind of range that I've come up math-wise with what they've been quoting to me. So if you look at sales 3 in VCP 212, comes in at 5 minutes and 36 seconds. And I can tell you from experience and looking at things recently, that's about right, give or take a couple of seconds. Made by man, not blessed by God. We're not going to be down to the exact millisecond on this stuff. So there is a little bit of slosh. But with VCP 212, sales 3 can take as little as 6 minutes or as long as 7 minutes and 12 seconds. Now that's a big deal, especially when we consider what Brian's going to talk about and the type of storm mode we're in, and then what kind of focus we want to have radar-wise on the storm mode at a distance from the radar. Okay, so you got to think, about 40 to 50 nautical miles from the radar is where things are kind of transition from, where you get a better low-level quality of coverage in the low levels within 40, 50 nautical miles to the RDA from beyond that point. And these are things that you need to keep in mind. And again, the math from a Merl perspective, let's take Merl 4, for instance. In VCP 212, Merl 4, 5 minutes and 51 seconds is about ballpark there. But in VCP 212, it can take as little as 6 minutes, 15 seconds, or as high as 7 minutes and 37 seconds. And again, this assumes a completely full scan to 19.4. And you also need to, at this point, add another 10 seconds for radar retrace too. These numbers do not include that. So, and this is one of those things that, as I've gone back and looked at past events from a variety of radars, and I've looked at everything from Pendleton, Oregon, Portland, Oregon, down to Jacksonville, Florida here in the past couple weeks, I can tell you I am seeing numbers like this. And all in between when it comes to VCP 212. There's been no lack of examples from VCP 212. So these numbers that you see on the high end, you may, well, they may be idealistic or something that's possible. Well, I can tell you we are seeing times as long as this. It's not all the time. It's a handful of cases. And most times it's in between what those two quoted times are. But nevertheless, when you look at the documentation, everything really focuses on VCP 212. But when it comes to VCP 212, which tends to be, and as we've seen both in observation from myself and then from our poll earlier, far more people use VCP 212. So don't necessarily fool yourself to think that you're getting very fast volume scans all the time with this. Now, again, with sales, you are getting a good cadence and a good rhythm and a good temporal resolution of 0.5 cuts. But nevertheless, if you are focused on the 0.5, but maybe you need some higher elevations and you're not looking at the 0.9 and 1.3 and they may be in play and you may need to take a look at that, it could be as high as 7+ minutes between seeing that 0.9 scan, which in a lot of cases, especially as you get closer to the RDA, that's a big deal. All right, so another thing to consider is don't forget to consider surrounding radars and their settings and what's going to be helpful as well. It's not just your radar, and it's not just you that uses the radar. Surrounding officers use your radar too. So you got to think about these things when you start to think about, okay, what's my strategy like? What should I be using? What VCP should I be in? What scanning strategy should I be in? So, Jim, I want to stop right there because I have a feeling we might have a few questions as it pertains to these VCP 212 scan times. So if anybody wants to raise their hand or type a question in and before we move on, because I want to make sure we have any questions or queries resolved before we move on to the very important information that Brian's going to talk about.
Okay, I'm looking at the questions here. I don't see any yet, but just a reminder, put your questions into the question box, and as soon as they pop up, then I can ask John. I know that when you showed me this data, I was pretty amazed by it. I mean, it is a big deal. If you're not seeing that 0.9 slice for 7 minutes, it could possibly mean the difference between, you know, seeing that tornado vortex to the west of the metropolitan area, and then the next time you see it, it's to the east of the metropolitan area.
Correct.
So I think
A
it's
lot
very
can
important.
happen in 7 minutes. A lot can happen.
I agree. I mean, I know when we started, you know, we always said a lot can happen in 5 minutes. Well, you know, this is 7 minutes, and it just complicates the matter. So you got to make sure that you know what you're looking at and where you should be looking at, and then what tools to use. I don't see any questions here, John. I don't know. You want me to switch?
Yeah. So go ahead. Let's go ahead and switch to Brian. And Brian's going to try and put this all together. So this is going to be the fun stuff. You got the ugly stuff out of the way with me, and the review. But now Brian's going to put this all together. So let's hand it off to Brian.
Okay. All right, Brian. I just switched and made you the presenter.
All right. Good deal. Let me start the presentation here, and let's present. All right. Yep. Hopefully you can see a big slide that says conceptual models.
Yep, looks great.
Awesome. Okay. Well, John, thanks for going into some really quality detail on this and diving into some of these times and running the calculations. I mean, no small task. Also wanted to send a shout out, at least for the next part of this presentation here. Corey Mead from Omaha and Jason Shaman from down in Springfield played a big role in putting together a lot of these slides. So the big question now is, what does it all mean and what do we do with it? And I think the biggest thing that we want to encourage is just a continuous and high level of critical thinking in terms of how we're going to drive the radar. How are we going to interact with the radar to get the data we need to make those more effective warning decisions? So we're going to try and at least break it down. I'll start out by saying there are no perfect answers for these examples, but there are good, better, and best. So let's go ahead and take a look. It's all about priorities, like so many things we do in our multitasking world that we're always living in. It's all about priorities. We've got to be asking ourselves, and by we, I mean the entire warning operations team, the people drawing the boxes, the mesoanalysis, the warning coordinator, really anybody in operations can speak up and say, hey, we're about to move into that range folding area. Would you like me to switch the radar setting? I think it's important to do that because in the heat of the moment, it's not always something that's at the top of your mind, right? So you've always got to be asking, what information do we need most? What do we need for this particular event, for this particular storm? What do we need the most? And that's going to fall back to, what are our primary hazards? If I've got 14 supercells on the radar and 3 of them have potential to be tornadic, the others are producing hail, well, I want to focus on probably those 3 storms, depending. And so you want to ask, where are your most dangerous storms in relation to the radar? What are my highest priority storms? And the auto PRF attempts to do that, but we need to think about PRFs. We need to think about what elevation scans we need, what levels, where is our LCL today? Where's our LFC? So I don't want to overcomplicate it because these are things that we're thinking about and discussing on any given day the way it is. I think it's just adding that reference to the radar frequently throughout the course of the event. Also, through the course of this process, I think it's really important for anyone looking at the radar to just ask themselves, what information is missing that I wish I had? So, gosh, I wish I could see that 1.3 degree slice for this storm more frequently. Well, am I in Merl? Because if that's not the case, then I can get that information just by changing radar settings. And so that's something that you've got to evaluate, because 10 minutes later you might be, maybe you switched to Merl, but then you said, oh, I wish I had the half degree a little bit more often because that was more beneficial. Well, let's go back to sales then, because we can do that. That the radar can handle these things, and it's driving the radar. Let's see here. Also, Be predictive when possible and reactive when needed. And I think that goes for almost anything we do in our predictive world. But you know, if you sit down before an event and you've got a good feel for where the storms are going to develop and what the hazards are going to be, you can get a really good first guess at what type of data you're going to want before the storms even develop. And you can put the radar into those settings right away. So again, be predictive when possible, be reactive when needed, and just constantly ask yourself, do I have all the information I need? And if I don't, is there more information that I can get by changing settings? So what we did, Corey, myself, Jason, and John, with input from the TWIP, much appreciated, by the way, we tried to break it down to hazard types and distances from the radar. And so this is just a one-page quick reference, and it's quick and dirty, and it's not perfect. It's far from perfect, in fact. And that's why I strongly encourage, even up in this gray box at the top, at any time, the radar operator should ask themselves if they are missing any valuable data. If so, it might be time to change scanning strategies. But at least for now, hopefully these colors stand out for everyone. But the blue indicates that perhaps Merl 4, 3, or 2 is your best option. Purple would maybe favor more of a sales 2 or 3. The green might favor more of a sales 1 type of a setting. It'd be very rare that we don't have some element of sales or Merl in place. There might be a scenario where that is favorable, but you know, having that extra half degree every now and then is typically worth the 30-second or so delay. But this chart here is specific to Merl and sales usage. And so it's not something that existed. We thought we'd put it together. And again, I really appreciate the wide range of input that we had on it. And you can see that as you go from left to right here, we're gaining distance from the radar. So if you've got a day where supercell tornadoes are your greatest threat, you're going to look at that top box. And you're going to say, all right, my storm is at 90 nautical miles from the radar. Sales 2 or 3 is probably going to be my best option. And what I'm going to do now is we're going to get into some of these specific types and talk about why. I think if we address the why of these, then maybe it can make a little bit more sense of scenarios where maybe it doesn't line up for this too. But let's go ahead. All right, so supercell tornadoes, that's everyone's favorite topic, so we'll start there, right? Supercells are complex beasts, but they're made up of varying scales of rotation, right? So you've got your mid-level mesocyclone depicted by that dark red swirly arrow. I've got it, 20,000 feet. This is a typical supercell that has a high top, and I just want to point out that they don't all look like this. I can say that I'm pretty sure at least one of our most significant tornado events in the last 3 years, which isn't saying much in eastern Nebraska, was a low top supercell case where we had cloud tops at like 25 to 30,000 feet. So that changes everything. But in your typical supercell scenario, you're going to be able to resolve that mid-level mesocyclone very well. And the mid-level mesocyclone is important. Okay, it's very important in supercells. But when you're getting more specifically into the tornado prediction side of things, that low-level mesocyclone, it gains importance, right? It's kind of a slightly different beast than the mid-level meso. It can be resolved by the radar. And that's the key point here. The key point I want to break out, and we'll talk about on the next slide, is that low-level meso, unless you're getting very far from the radar, you can typically resolve that rotation. And that is important because the tornado itself is honestly, it's not resolved very well or very often by the radar. A tornado itself tends to be so small that it can fall within one range bin and cancel itself out. So more often than not, what you are seeing on radar is the low-level mesocyclone and not necessarily the tornado. Now, there are exceptions to that, of course, but that is important. We've got to understand what we're seeing and why it's important. And as we overlay the epitome of supercell tornadoes, the El Reno storm as it was developing, here you've got it once again. It overlays pretty smoothly, where you've got the mid-level mesocyclone, the low-level rotation, and then the tornado vortex itself. All right, so let's step on forward and let's talk just briefly about why it's important. Tornado formation, by most recent accounts, / all recent research is a bottom-up process. All right, tornadoes have been found to develop at the ground level, the tornado itself. We're not going to see that with radar. We can only predict it. That's our job, right? We need to predict tornadoes before they happen. I don't want to discount, while we're talking about velocity a lot, just in this particular presentation here, evaluation of dual pole data is extremely important, especially in the low levels. If I can get extra dual pole data at ½ degree, and it's say 1,000 feet or below, that's invaluable, because you can calculate things like the KDP ZDR separation vector. You can analyze the presence of size sorting and how that's going to affect your low-level mesocyclone before it develops. It's going to be able to predict the strengthening before you can see it on the radar. This is very important. It gives you extra time in advance. But as far as just analyzing the low-level mesocyclone, this is important because that low-level rotation is a significant contributor to enhanced vertical vorticity at the ground level through stretching. It generates that vertical pressure gradient force, and it stretches that vertical vorticity that exists at the ground, stretches it up and helps enhance it, magnify it into that tornado vortex itself. And once again, I want to say the low-level mesocyclone can be resolved in most cases. And so we want to focus on what we can see from the radar. We can see size sorting in our dual pole moments. We can see the existence, at least, or intensification of a low-level mesocyclone and how that will affect the vorticity in the short term. So we can see that, and we want to focus on how to see that best. All right, so here we get some 50,000 foot tall clouds, right, at various distances from the radar. And each one of these lines here, this is the typical VCP 12 or 212 scanning angles. And so each one of these lines is a slice. And so let's look at this first storm over on the left, right? And we've got our white arrow now indicates the mid-level meso, or at least some semblance of it. The yellow arrow is more of the low-level mesocyclone. And if you've got a storm close to the radar, where this first one on the left is, say at about 20 nautical miles, you may actually shoot under the low-level mesocyclone with your ½ degree slice, right? Sure, you might be able to resolve a tornado at ½ degree, but some of your best data are going to be present at the 0.9, 1.3, and 1.8 degree elevations. And so when you're inside of 40 nautical miles, this can be a case where sails is not nearly as beneficial as Merl. Not to mention ground clutter effects and things like that. You can get some really messy data at ½ degree in your velocity and otherwise, where per at 0.9, 1.3, things become much clearer. And so even if you're in Merl 4 and the worst possible PRF per John's presentation there, and you're shooting over 7 minutes a scan in Merl 4, the good news is you're getting data at 0.5, 0.9, 1.3, and 1.8. You're getting that every 3 to 3.5 minutes. And so that is by nature better than just the base scan. Also, if you'd be running sails in that scenario, that would be suboptimal unless your ½ degree data are excellent, because you'd only be getting 0.9 degree information every roughly 6.5 to 7 minutes. And that's not something we want to work with. As John and Jim said, a lot can happen in 5 to 7 minutes. So if you go out a little bit farther, say 50 miles, that middle storm, 50 nautical miles from the radar, that's where we're starting to get up there, where your ½ degree slice is at about 5,000 feet. Your 0.9 degree slice, you're hitting about 7,000 feet. So these are where you have to start making those decisions. And this is where we have that kind of shaded area in our chart, right? Where maybe Merl is good, maybe sails is better. This is where the warning operators, the coordinator, the meso analyst, they need to be thinking critically about what information am I missing? What information could I be getting? And what should I set the radar to do that in order to get that information? As you go farther out, ½ degree becomes more and more your best chance at observing the low-level mesocyclone. So that's where sails becomes a little bit more effective. Not to say that there aren't important features that you want to see in the mid and upper levels as well, documenting updraft strength, intensity changes, your ZDR column heights, even your reflectivity heights, beware existence, so on and so forth. There's so much you can look at. The question is, at what frequency do you need to see that compared to other elements of the storm? I could talk on this all day. I better move on. Here's an example of very close to the radar. So we're at 25 nautical miles. The top left is your half-degree slice. Pretty unimpressive, right? Now, that might not be saying that the storm is not capable of producing a tornado just because your half-degree slice doesn't look all that impressive, right? For starters, we should be using things like KDP and ZDR and other elements as well, inflow intensity. There's so much we can look at in addition to velocity. But per at least the topic of this discussion, there's a chance that you're shooting underneath that strongest low-level mesocyclone just because of how the low-level meso sources a lot of its vorticity. It's got to tilt it and stretch it, and that takes height to do that. So as you go up to 0.9 and 1.3 and 1.8, you can see that even though we're only at, all of these are below 6,400 feet, this is actually a very intense low-level mesocyclone. And you can track the intensification, the changes, and you might be able to see that it is intensifying, which would imply a more significant stretching of that near surface vorticity that already exists. So you really want to watch these things, and this would be a case where Merl is going to be much more effective than sails. Sails would be reactionary in this case. When you see that rotation start to tighten up at half degree, you might be too late. The tornado may have already occurred. And so we need to do our best to observe the full onslaught of data in the best way possible and be thinking about the cause and effect, where maybe in this case, the cause of the tornado, 5 minutes before it starts, is an intensification of that vertical pressure gradient force by the low level meso. So one way or another, the key here is if there's a tornado threat close to the radar, Merl is probably going to be more beneficial than sails. Probably. There might be cases where that's not the case, and that's for our critical thinking at that date and time. Another example here, this is 28 nautical miles from the radar, very similar to the last one. We've got data dropouts at half degree. It just doesn't look impressive. You go up to 3,300 feet and 4,700 feet, and suddenly things look a little more interesting, where you've got a little bit stronger low-level mesocyclone than you would have ever seen at half degree. So again, very similar scenario right there. QLCS mesovortices in tornadoes, you're going to find that at least the recommendations are similar. Mesovortices, they're not tornadoes, but they can produce them, obviously, and they tend to develop on average roughly in that 3,000 to 5,000 foot layer above ground. And I think we all know they can develop and intensify quickly, right? Tornadic versions are typically stronger and longer lived. And I highlighted here in the yellow box, this is a graphic modified from Atkins and Laurent, where your vertical vorticity is the purple line. That tends to intensify rapidly in the 100 to 400 meter above ground range. And so that's where you want to be looking in that kind of 1,000 to 5,000 foot area for the intensification if possible. Also, research has shown that a lot of times pre-tornadic mesovortices, they tighten up their diameter immediately before tornadogenesis. This is important because smaller rotation also means harder to resolve, right? But we can do that. We can resolve it, especially if we're close to the radar. And a lot of times that intensification occurs above the half degree cut when you're within 40 miles of the radar. So you're seeing a trend here. And so I've highlighted same scenario, but this is extremely similar to what we talked about with supercell tornadoes. If you're inside of 40 miles, the half degree slice may not be your most beneficial for identifying these. Rather, your 0.9, 1.3, and 1.8 can be much more beneficial depending on the case. So this is something where Merl, again, can be extremely helpful with close range tornadogenesis and prediction thereof. Once you get farther out, then your half degree becomes one of your only options for identifying these. And so, again, it's dependent on the case, but we need to critically think about it. And so this is the reasoning, at least, behind the chart that we show. A couple of examples here once again. Half degree on the top left, looks interesting. We look up at 1.8 degrees, and that is much more intense, 1.3, 1.8, and 0.9 degrees. All more intense. And so you can see where if we're getting these 3 higher elevation scans every 3 minutes, give or take, as opposed to every 6 to 7 minutes with an abundance of half-degree data, I know that I want to see what's at 0.9 for this case, and this is 20 miles from the radar. Another example right here from out in Ohio, the half-degree slice up in the top right, that's at about 1,000 feet above radar level. Pretty innocuous, doesn't look all that impressive, but as we go up to 3,000 and 6,000 feet, suddenly that's much more interesting in terms of it being a true rotation and stronger in addition. So again, I just don't want people to get held up on using sales 3 in cases when the 0.9, 1.3, and 1.8 degree slices might be more beneficial. One last one here, same story once again. Not too impressive at half degree, but you could get some lead time on this tornado if you were watching at 0.9 and 1.3. And so you want those frequent updates at those levels. That's at 25 nautical miles for this one. Hail. All right, let's shift gears. And I'm running slow, so I'm gonna blast through this a little bit. I think we all know that a lot of hail development occurs in the mid-levels. A lot of the signals that we see for very large hail are evident in the mid-levels, such as mid-level mesocyclone strength, the mid-level updraft diameter, which is what Dennis and Kumjin showed in this graphic at the right. If you have a greater diameter of updraft, you tended to get larger hail in these storms. Updraft intensity and height is easily measured, through the 20 and 30,000 foot layers. So how does this matter for us? Well, it's typically at a greater range from the radar, where maybe when we get outside of 80 nautical miles, suddenly the Merl slices can give us pretty much all the data we need in order to predict very large hail, if you've got that as an exclusive threat in a storm. If you're out at a great distance, 1.8 degrees, that might be hitting the storm at 25 to 30,000 feet. And so being able to monitor changes in your rotational velocity, your ZDR fields, so on and so forth, through that height at a greater frequency would be really beneficial. So that's where, at a great range from the radar, for a hailstorm as the exclusive threat, Merl can be highly useful. And I've used that here this year in those scenarios already, and it's been nice. So let's see here, an example at 95 nautical miles from the RDA. This is where your 1.8 degree slice is at 23,781 feet. I know that here in the Omaha area, we've got some locations that would be much higher than that. We've still got a warn for up in Knox County. But you can see that you're going to be able to, while we've only got reflectivity here, you're going to be able to closely monitor those changes in updraft intensity and size through that 0.9, 1.3, and 1.8 degree slice better than you could by using sales or even just the base evaluation. So this is a case where Merl would be quite beneficial. Organized damaging wind is another one. This gets a little funky, and it kind of depends on what you want to evaluate. If you're just purely interested in a well-developed cold pool and how it's going to evolve, and you want as many possible data points observing that as you can get, then yeah, you're going to want to be in sales. You're going to want to be in the highest PRF available, so you can get the greatest frequency possible and the greatest data quality possible. I don't want to skip past these. I know I'm very focused on Merl and sales, but also the higher PRF you use, generally speaking, the more frequent your data are going to be, and you're also typically going to have a higher data quality in the velocity fields as well. Now, there are some cases where you may want to more closely monitor the rear inflow jet. Say if that rear inflow jet is maybe surging toward the front of the line or is descending right at the front of the line, you may want to evaluate that a little more closely, and that can be a time when Merl is more beneficial. You might want to shoot a little bit higher and get some more frequent evaluation at those levels in order to predict the intensification of winds. All right, so we come back around here. I'm not going to hit them all. That we talk about land spouts briefly, microbursts. You can see there's a lot of shading, a lot of differences. The bottom line, and I can't say this enough, is we need to be critically thinking about what data will be most beneficial for our warning process, and if and how we can get those data flowing. All right, and we've got to remember too that we can change things. You can change the settings to get what you need, or at least to try to get what you need. And with the PRF, I've noticed more so this spring that there are times when we've got to manually change that PRF because auto storm PRF doesn't always do the job. It can bounce around quite a bit. It's somewhat unpredictable, but just keep in mind, it's not set it and forget it. You can't just set it and walk away. It's a process, and we need to be thinking about the engineering of the radar when we do that. All right, so let's run through one example. This is the last thing I've got today. We've got some poll questions for anyone not sleeping yet. All right, so here we go. We're heading up to southeast South Dakota. We've got a pretty solid storm cluster at point A here, and A is about 100 nautical miles from the radar. Storm B over here is developing rapidly, and that's more of a supercellular storm. That's at about 80 nautical miles from the radar. So we're at pretty great distance. These things are moving generally toward the radar. And so for the storm A, the near-term primary hazard is wind-driven hail, right? We're just, whether that's true or not, we're just gonna say it. Wind-driven hail, a pretty big deal. Down at storm B, the near-term primary hazard is hail with a non-zero chance for tornadoes. So the question is, and we'll go to the poll question up here next, what VCP and what settings do you choose? And so again, I know this isn't super easy, but take your best stab. The poll is open. You can go with VCP 12, VCP 212, Merl 4 or Sales 3. What kind of PRF settings do you want? Notice they all say AVSET on. There is no scenario, at least in this case, where having AVSET off would be beneficial. So I made that one easy for y'all. But at, again, the wind-driven hail storm cluster, that's about 100 nautical miles. The developing supercell with primary threat of hail is about 80 nautical miles. So let's see what people think.
Must be a more difficult question, Brian. We only got 35% have voted so far. So a lot of critical thinking going on right now.
We'll go with that. I'm sure I didn't put anyone to sleep.
Yeah. All right. Are you able to see when I turned on the answers, that the actual answers?
Nope, can't see it.
Okay. All right. I'm going to wait until we're just over 50%, and then I'll turn it on here.
Sounds good. All right. So all right. I can't see the results.
Can you see the answers? We got 47% said C and 35% said D.
Okay. Hey, that's pretty solid. Here's the trick for this and the next two questions. There's no perfect answer. So there's a wishy-washy little tidbit for you. I think C is a really good option here for me personally, and it's going to depend on what your threat is. But for that wind-driven hailstorm, at least at this point in time, I would take that as being my greatest hazard, my greatest risk. And so out there at 100 nautical miles, if you're using Merl 4, you're going to get a really good glance at it all the way up through about 28-ish thousand feet, give or take. Now you're going to have that data through 28,000 feet approximately every 3 to 3.5 minutes. That's going to be pretty beneficial. I don't think you're probably missing out on anything above that. But then we've got this little storm down here on the Nebraska border, and we have to think if you're using Merl 4, you're getting half-degree slices every 3 to 3.5 minutes, as well as 0.9 and 1.3. There's a chance that if you really are worried about tornado potential in that storm, you might want to go with more of a sales approach to it. The one other thing that we haven't looked at very closely here, and that you'll have to consider in the near future, is that your PRF range folding ring is inside the radar from these points. So at some point, these storms are both going to move through that range folding area, and you're going to have to do some wiggling with the PRFs unless the auto PRF does it for you. So it's going to be something you'll want to pay close attention to. You might select the storm that you want to focus on and use that single storm PRF. But again, great critical thinking. These are all things we're working with. And I do want you to keep in mind that VCP 12 will be faster. And so if you want to use Merl 4 and VCP 12, that might not be a bad option. especially if you can crank the PRF way up and still get good data. The problem is sometimes there's a little bit of trial and error with this. So again, VCP12 will increase the frequency of your data, potentially at a cost of some data quality. And the question is just how much data quality issues it costs you, and you may not know until you actually take a look at it. So these are all things to consider. It's a give and take. What's more important? Perfect or near perfect data, time, what are your hazards, things like that. So let's move on. The storms have advanced. This is about an hour and a half, 2 hours later. So we've taken quite a jump. And we've now got storms A, B, and C. So storm A here, near just northwest of all of it. I hope I pronounced that right. It's got a little bit of a tornado threat, right? Tornado hazard in that area. We're rotating. We've got some things going on there. Secondary hazards of wind and hail. Storm B is out at 90 nautical miles from the radar. That looks like a pretty windy little guy. Possibly some hail in that as well. And then storm C is pretty close to the radar. There might be some wind involved in that, but at first glance, storm C is probably your lowest priority storm at this moment. So let's do it one more time here. Be thinking, what radar settings do you want? You've got storm A at 50 nautical miles, storm B at 90, storm C at 35. What would you like your radar to be in?
All right, the poll is open.
Excellent. So just, I'm pretty sure you're all probably seeing the questions as opposed to my screen. So keep in mind, probably your primary storm with the tornado threat is at about 50 nautical miles from the radar. It's moving toward the radar, which is important to note as well. Your secondary storm with wind and hail potential is at about 90 nautical miles. Your tertiary threat is in there at 35 nautical miles.
You got a lot of people thinking. We got 28% in. Get those votes in, people.
Get them in.
Make that decision quick.
Remember, there's no wrong answer until you're in the event and you make the change and realize you wish you hadn't made that change. But
right now, we got a pretty high favorability for D.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. And again, there's no perfect answer here. VCP 212 with Merl 4, that's going to give you a pretty good resolution for that storm at about 50 nautical miles. It may be a situation where sales serves you better in the near term, but then as it moves inside of 40 or 35 nautical miles, you might want to lean towards Merl. It's kind of in that gray area, and I chose that time frame intentionally. It's not clear cut. So in this case,
the second answer was E, the second most favorable at 27%. So they're kind of flashing back between that sales 3 and the Merl, because I think you're kind of on that 40 to 50 nautical miles. So
yep, and I think those are both good options. I do want to recommend that people strongly consider VCP 12 too. And so if this is a case where time is your most important element, you're going to get data more frequently in VCP 12. And here at 50 nautical miles, you're inside of that range ring for PRF 8. So you're probably going to be able to get some pretty high quality velocity data in the PRF 8. So this is, again, you kind of feel it out. I don't want to turn people away from 12, because again, there's a chance that the data quality could be almost just as high as VCP 212. And then you get more frequent data, but every case is a little bit different. And so let's step forward to one more here. And we've come a little closer to Sioux Falls, and quite an evolution in the storm, and probably several of you know what storm this is by this point. But we're starting to get some interesting little rotation signatures, some surges in the line, the UDCZ. And we're in at 15 nautical miles from the radar at this point. You do have a secondary storm B with, it looks to be pretty windy out at about 55 nautical miles. But really your main concern right now is inside at 15 nautical miles, potential for quick spin ups tornado genesis. So here we go. Let's open poll number 3. And which radar settings would you choose? Do you want VCP 12 with Merl or Sales? Do you want VCP 212 with Merl, Sales 3, Sales 2? So many options. The good news is for these, I've set it to AVSET on, even though that won't matter. You're going to get a full 19.5 degrees no matter what. So here at close range to the radar, that's important because every single one of your scans is going to go the full distance, the full allotted time. You've got to take every cut. So time is an issue here. And I think that's where making a decision between 12 and 212 is maybe important. Also, you're inside of 60 nautical miles for all your storms. So I'm going to make an assumption that your auto PRF storm is going to do a pretty good job here. It's probably not going to drop any range rings in here at 15 nautical miles. And by probably, I mean it won't. But yeah, I'll let you continue your critical thinking.
Yeah, we're at about 37% voted in strong preference towards A, VCP 12 with Merl 4.
All right, and I think that's awesome. That's some quality critical thinking. We have changed the settings now probably 3 times in 3 different scenarios for the same event. VCP 12 again is going to give you that faster repeat time. Merl 4 is almost definitely the optimal option here. Maybe one of the only cases where you would opt for Sales is if you know that tornadoes are ongoing and you want to quickly and easily track their intensity based on a lot of the research that we've looked at or that has come out in the past 5 years. But for this case, I think we don't have tornadoes ongoing just yet, to my knowledge. We're going to want to closely monitor Merl 4, almost definitely. And then again, 12 is going to give us that faster repeat time. I think if you find that the velocity data are suffering, then you might want to kick back over to 212, but still keep Merl 4. So, all right, excellent. Thank you all for your participation. And let's wrap it up. This has actually gone over an hour, so I apologize, I'm long-winded. But we've got to consider a lot of things, and many of these you can consider before even starting an event. Storm mode, prioritization of hazards, the mesoscale environment, with LCLs and LFCs, where are those low-level mesos going to develop in the vertical so that you can see them? What's your coverage going to be like? Are you going to have crummy convection right next to the radar so that you're stuck with full AVSET, going all the way to 19.5 degrees, even though your most important storms are way out at 100 nautical miles? This is going to be important. Are you inheriting storms? Are they moving into your area, or are they developing overhead? Where are they? Do you expect explosive development where you need to be thinking very fast? And bottom line, just Sales versus Merl. Which data do you need for a given situation? And so in operations, and John, feel free to jump in, but listen to and actively assist your warning forecaster. John and I both agree this is typically not the warning forecaster's job to actually be messing with the radar. It's probably a really good job for the meso analyst or the warning coordinator or just somebody who's able to take requests from the warning forecaster and make those changes. Beware auto PRF. There can be bouncing around from scan to scan. Understand the limitations and be sure that the best PRF is being utilized. VCP 212, those Doppler cut scan times are going to vary quite a bit. Lower the PRF, the longer the scan time, and you want to be nimble and proactive. Adjust it. Use your manual PRF when necessary. Drive the radar. Drive the radar like you drive a car. Make it go where you want it to go. And then continuous monitoring. You might have to make a point to at least address every hour as part of your meso analysis. You might want to do it much more frequently than that. Just talk about it. It's good to think about and talk about. We linked up some resources here. The TWIP is developing some range rings. You've got an example here. They're not quite ready, but hopefully that'll come out soon. A little bit of a teaser there. And those range rings are designed or will be designed to help make these decisions and kind of keep it in the back of your mind. Situational awareness. This one pager here with the radar scanning strategies, that's the graphic we've been showing with the purples, greens, and blues. A couple other things as well. But again, we've gone a long time. I really appreciate y'all joining in and following along and participating. If you have any questions, please fire away. And otherwise, I'll head up to the screen here. And yeah,
all right.
Any questions? Go ahead.
Great job, Brian and John.